Okay, welcome to lesson 2 of week 2. Um, so you should be coming into this lesson having already written down your pre-theoretical thoughts on the ethics bull case life in the parking lot. Um, so now we're going to take a look at an ethical theory to help us understand the trolley car problem as well as more complex moral cases like life in a parking lot. Now, if you have not yet done that pre-theoretical discussion post, I'd recommend going to do that now, because if you have not studied ethics before, this is perhaps your last opportunity to document your ethical thinking before I, corrupt you with ethical theory and you start to see the world forever and irrevocably as a philosopher does. Okay, so I mentioned in lesson 1, right, when we were talking about the trolley car problem. Um, that perhaps one of the intuitions that we could formalize into a principle that justifies killing the one and saving the five in that example as something like the right thing to do is the one that saves the most amount of lives, right? This theory that we're going to take a look at, utilitarianism, tries to do something similar to that, but with more reasoning behind it and in a perhaps more sophisticated way. So it continues to give us resources to articulate that intuition that we have, that the right thing to do is, or at least presumably the right thing to do, is to flip the switch, killing the one to save the five. Okay, so utilitarianism is one of the most prolific moral theories. So it's widely used in ethical discourse as well as by lay people who are discussing ethics, right? Let me make this a little bit bigger here. And so utilitarianism is a theory that is defined and understood best by these 4 components, right? So I'm going to talk about each one of them in sequence. The first one is that utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, right? So consequentialist theories concern themselves with the outcomes, the consequences of our actions. So it's going to define that the right thing to do is whatever creates the best consequences. Now you could have a lot of different kinds of consequentialist theories, right? You could have a paperclip consequentialist theory. The right thing to do is the thing that produces the most paperclips in the world. Now that would be a highly implausible moral theory, but there are other kinds of normative theories, that is, theories that tell you what you should do, that are consequentialist. Take for instance, in business, right? Presumably, what the right thing to do is, from a business perspective, is to maximize income, right? To maximize profit. That could be a consequence theory, right? The right thing to do is that which produces the consequences that have the highest profit, right? So that could be a consequentialist theory. Utilitarianism is trying to increase the consequences, or not to bring about the consequences that has the most welfare in it, right? So that brings us to this next part of the definition, which is welfarist. So utilitarianism is a welfarist theory, meaning that it concerns itself with what is good for people, right? So this is very different than a profit-based consequentialist theory, which is concerned with what is best for profit. This is a welfarist theory, what is best for welfare. Utilitarians have a very specific conception of welfare, typically, which is hedonism. Hedonism, or Hedonism, is a theory of the good, which says that the good thing in life is pleasure. The bad thing in life is pain or suffering. Okay? So, in terms of consequences, utilitarians are trying to bring about the consequences that have the most amount of happiness for the people involved, and is trying to avoid pain. This is, at first blush, pretty reasonable, right? Most of what we do in life, if you press people hard enough, they're going to say, why do I do what I do? It's because I want to be happy, right? And I'll give you an example. If you asked me, right, why do you want to be a philosophy professor? I'd be like, well, it's because education is something that's inherently valuable, and that's what I want to do in a life of service to others. And they might say, okay, well, why do you want to live a life of service to others? And I say, well, that's the most important thing I could do ethically. Okay, well, why is it important to you for you to do something ethically? And I could say, well, because I think that's my conception of the good life. And it's like, okay, well, why is the good life important to you, right? Well, I want to be happy, right? That's the reason at the very basic level why I want to do anything. And presumably this applies to you. You know, why are you studying what you're studying? Why are you putting yourself through all of that hard work of studying in college? Well, you know, break that down long enough and you're going to get to because I want to be happy. So a hedonistic theory is one that speaks directly to this intuition that I think we can all, at some level, get on board with. So, yes, utilitarianism so far is a consequentialist, welfarist, specifically hedonistic theory. Now, utilitarianism is also an aggregationist theory. That means it concerns itself with the sum total of the amount of happiness in the world. So it's not concerned with your happiness per se, or my happiness. It's concerned with the total amount of happiness in the world. Okay? And finally, the last tenet of utilitarianism is that it is an impartial theory, or it has an equal consideration of interests. Your happiness does not count any more than my happiness, right? It doesn't matter where that happiness comes from. All that matters is that the amount of happiness units in the world, one happiness unit is one happiness unit. You know, so it's not trying to maximize happiness for any one person. Okay, so we take all of these things together, and utilitarianism. The reason why it's called utilitarianism, by the way, is because those happiness units are what utilitarians will call utility, right? Utilitarianism, it tries to promote utility, otherwise known as the net amount of happiness in the world. Taken together, utilitarianism can be thus understood as the principle of utility, okay? So the right thing to do, according to utilitarianism, is to do that action which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people and the least amount of suffering. That's what it boils down to, okay? So this is how you can apply this to any situation, and you can ask yourself, what action can I take in this example, or in this scenario, to produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people with the least amount of suffering? That is, on this theory, the right thing to do. All right, but it doesn't stop there. You know, it's kind of easy to just say something produces the great amount of happiness, or, you know, the greater good. But utilitarians are very specific about what this means, and not even most or all of utilitarian philosophers actually look into what this means, okay? So the originator of this theory, Jeremy Bentham and the philosopher John Stuart Mill, they were very specific about what all goes into determining what the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number means, okay? So they developed a process for determining what this looks like, and that they call it the hedonistic calculus, right? So I already mentioned utilitarianism is a hedonistic theory. It is also known as the calculus of felicity. Okay, so they break it down according to these criteria. How exactly do we measure, and how do we understand pain and pleasure, right? These are the two poles on the utilitarian theory about the good in life, pleasure, and the bad in life, pain. Okay? So first, they're going to ask you, when you're doing the hedonistic calculus, how intense is the pleasure or pain, right? And this is important because an intense pleasure is going to be worth more happiness, or an intense pain is going to be worth or to be negative utility. Okay, so imagine, for example, the intensity of the pleasure of finding a penny. You know, oh, cool, a penny, right? I'll pocket that. Or the pleasure of injecting heroin. Okay, where your brain and every single opioid receptor that you have in your brain is just overwhelmed, and it produces this ecstatic feeling. The intensity of those different experiences is obviously different, right? Let's take a look at the converse, right? The intensity of pain, right? On the low end, you might have something like your cat jumping on your stomach in the middle of the night. You know, uncomfortable, but, you know, you could probably go right back to sleep. Compared with something like breaking your femur bone in half, right? Excruciatingly painful. So the intensity of those experiences matter. Next, they're going to want to ask about duration, right? How long does that pain or pleasure last? That seems to matter. Right? Take for instance the pleasure of seeing a meme on Instagram, right? It's pretty momentary, right? You have that maybe if it's a good one, that momentary blast of air from your nostrils as you're kind of laughing at what happened. You scroll to the next one and then it's over, right? Very quick. Compare this to getting married. This is presumably something that is going to last for a long time, and this is a life partner that you have that produces pleasure over a long period of time. Evolutionarily, about 11 years on average, but that not necessarily, right? So again, for pain in terms of duration, imagine stubbing your toe. Really hurts for maybe a minute and then it goes away. Versus chronic pain, right? A condition that some people are unlucky to have, where they feel pain for no apparent reason for their entire lives. Okay, the duration of those experiences certainly matter, even though maybe the intensity differs from that. Stubbing your toe really, really hurts for a short amount of time. Chronic pain, certainly painful, and I don't really have any experience, but it could be a low level of pain over a long amount of time. But that's not what we're talking about, right? The duration is something different from the intensity. Okay? We can also talk about the certainty of that pain. What's the probability that the pain or pleasure will occur? So take, for instance, a high probability or a high certainty pleasure would be something like eating ice cream. Right? Most times when you eat ice cream, there's a high degree of probability that's going to bring pleasure. Certainly does for me, right? On the converse, right, again, for me, what is something that you can do that has a very low probability of pleasure? Well, that would be going for a run, right? I will admit, I got into running for a little bit, and occasionally I'd be like, hey, that was a good run. But the vast majority of the time, I'd be like, that sucked. I hated that. Why did I ever think this was a good idea? Right? So the certainty of pleasure from those two experiences can certainly differ. Next, we have a pretty funky word here, the propinquity. How far off in the future will the pain or pleasure occur? Okay? So this is important because imagine the duration of time that you have to wait for a particular pleasure might impact the amount of happiness it brings you. Take, for instance, there's a classic experiment in psychology of the double marshmallow experiment, right? Children are often in this experiment are presented with a single marshmallow, and they say, the adult, I'm going to leave the room now. I'm going to leave you in this room with one marshmallow, and if you come back in 10 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows, right? Well, for children, they tend to, it's mixed here depending on what they do. Many children will just eat the marshmallow. They're like, 1 marshmallow now is worth more to me than 2 marshmallows in 10 minutes. As adults, we're a little bit better at delayed gratification, so we might wait for the 2 marshmallows. But this varies, right? If you're told that you're going to get the best experience of your life, but it's 20 years down the line, you might settle for some lesser pleasure in the meantime. Right? Similarly, the risk of pain much further down the line is less present to us in our minds than some kind of pain that's immediate, right? Take again, drug use is a great example here. The propinquity of that pain is pretty low. We get a high intensity experience now, and yeah, it's going to cause us health problems down the line. Yeah, it's going to in the case of opioids, destroy our ability to feel pleasure in the future. But that's way down the line, and I'm going to live forever. So who cares about that, right? Okay. Next, we have the fecundity of the pain or pleasure, which is the probability that the pleasure will lead to other pleasures, okay? So, for instance, going for a run, though it might have a very low certainty of pleasure, the fecundity of that pleasure might actually be pretty high, right? When I experienced, it was only after running that I started to actually get some pleasure out of running when I was into that. And indeed, this is a kind of experience that you can have that the more you do it, the more likely it's going to bring returns on that investment, right? Arguably studying, right? Your education can be something like this. Again, maybe a low certainty of pleasure, but its fecundity, it's good. It is a pleasure that begets more pleasure. Now, let's take an example from earlier. Injecting heroin has terrible fecundity, meaning that, again, it is a high intensity pleasure, but its fecundity is awful because it destroys the ability to experience pleasure in the future. So this degrades that particular pleasure because it has poor fecundity. Okay, purity is another concept that we can talk about in terms of pain, right? So again, take for instance, let's stick with our drug example, right? Injecting heroin. The probability that the pain will compound on itself is really high, right? Heroin addicts, kind of go down this slippery slope, and it is a kind of experience that leads from one bad thing, or from one, maybe poor fecundity good thing, to then worse and worse and worse. It's the purity of that pleasure is very poor because it has so much suffering entailed with it, right? Contrast this with giving your loved one a hug, right? This is not a kind of pleasure that you experience that causes you pain later down the line, or is kind of a trade-off between pain and pleasure. It's a very high purity pleasure, because nothing but good comes from it for both you and for the person you're hugging, presumably, right? Okay. Finally, the utilitarian is going to ask in the hedonistic calculus, what is the extent of this pleasure, right? How many people or how many other beings of moral consideration are going to be affected by your action here? So I've got two examples for you. The first one is, imagine saving a spider, right? You see a spider in your house, or in Houston, a cockroach in your house, and instead of squashing it with your shoe, you go and take it and place it outside. Okay, the extent of this action is very low, right? It is not likely to change the way, or not likely to impact many other people. It's not likely that that action is going to have ripple effects out from it. Okay, let's take a look at something with a larger extent, like the trolley car problem. Okay. No matter who gets run over by the trolley, right, the extent of that person was presumably, guaranteed to be someone's family, right? There are going to be people who employed that person, people who relied on that person, people who could have been served by that one person. And so the extent of the action of choosing to take a life, right, or trying to make the most of a bad situation like we do in the trolley car problem, the extent is significant, right? But also notice the extent for killing the 5 people in the trolley car problem is even much greater, right? The extent is presumably multiplied by 5, if not more, because more people, and therefore the extent of their influence was much further out. Okay, so the calculus of felicity is extremely important when applying utilitarianism, because you need to be able to articulate exactly how we're going to be cashing out our principle of utility, right? The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people and the least amount of suffering, it's not a good idea to just assert that, right? That, yes, my action will in fact produce this, and trust me on that, right? Rather, it is a far stronger argument to be able to talk about these various factors when you're comparing two outcomes, right? You can talk about the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent of the pains and pleasures involved in order to show, right, to show your work on why the principle of utility applies and when it doesn't, okay? So let's take a look at our examples that we looked at in Lesson 1. In Lesson 1, we were looking for our intuitions. Something about this example, we, at least the majority of people would say the right thing to do is to switch the trolley so that it hits the 1 rather than the 5. If we are to apply a utilitarian lens, or the utilitarian moral theory to this problem, what we're first going to do is we're going to say, okay, I want to do the right action, and so I will apply the principle of utility. I'm going to determine what action is going to produce the greatest number of, or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people and the least amount of suffering. This is pretty easy, right? Because we have again, because this is a thought experiment, we've isolated a lot of variables here. We don't know anything in particular about these people, though in a proper application of the calculus of felicity, we might be able to talk about how different people, right? Remember the Jeff Bezos example, the good Jeff Bezos, right? Potentially the extent of the good that he stands to do in that previous example, and I'll just rehash that just in case. The idea was that, say this one person was the good Jeff Bezos, that next week he promises to end all, to end world hunger, to give us all, $1,000. He stands to make a good impact in the world. The extent of the pains and pleasures that this person stands to provide to the world may change how we apply the hedonistic calculus, right? But absent that information, we would have to say the extent of the pain and the caused by one person dying, right? We can talk about their friends, family, and relatives who would be affected by that, but certainly that would be multiplied by at least 5 if the trolley ran over 5 people instead. So by discussing the hedonistic calculus, we can exactly articulate how the various pains and pleasures involved in this example results in the principle of utility, suggesting that the correct moral answer for this situation is to flip the switch. Okay? Hopefully that is you're seeing how you can make an argument with this. That this is a stronger argument, a better opinion to have than just an intuition, right? An intuition is good to have. It is the spark of ethics, but these moral theories allow us to articulate and argue in quite precise detail why we think what we think, and even though it might have started from an intuition, we can then move from there to make this moral argument. All right, let's try to apply this one more time. So let's take a look at the doctor example again. And this is a little bit more complicated, right? So the patients who are here, right, to rehash this example, right? This is you're the doctor. You have 5 patients all suffering from organ failure in your hospital wing, and we have determined somehow that this special person out in the waiting room, if they have an organ match for all of our 5 donors, and by killing the one to save the 5, we will have saved 5 lives at the expense of 1. So the math has not changed from the original, but perhaps our hedonistic calculus has, right? We know more information than we do in the original example, so we could talk about, the intensity of pain that the person who we kill in order to harvest their organs is maybe higher than a suffering that's caused from organ failure, but maybe not. Maybe certainly the duration of the pain, right? If we kill the patient in the waiting room very quickly, the duration is very low, even if the intensity is high, and even if it's a lower intensity of pain by those patients experiencing organ failure, the duration is longer, right? So you see how we have something more to talk about here. The certainty is different, right? It is possible, right, that maybe these patients in need of organs transplant later on get off the list and receive that transplant that they need. So the certainty is less certain than getting run over by a train, right? That's pretty certain. It is not certain, when or exactly how it's going to cause these deaths, though, for the purposes of a thought experiment, we could solidify that variable. We could stipulate what that is going to be. But in real life, we wouldn't really know. Okay, the propinquity again is well, sorry, I guess I was discussing a little bit of propinquity when I was talking about certainty. But it's also, the propinquity of the pain and pleasure here. Not as much to say about that. Again, this could be soon. It could not be, depending on what kind of organ is failing. But we could discuss that, right? The fecundity. Here, it's really interesting, actually. What's the probability that increasing the pleasure of the patients by their continued existence is likely to lead to other pleasures? Well, again, I hinted, in a society where you could walk into a waiting room and then you get sacrificed at a moment's notice, who would walk into waiting rooms anymore, right? It is a kind of, opportunistic thing that wouldn't be able to continue, or shouldn't be able to continue, if there were laws in place, or if people stopped showing up to waiting rooms, right? So the fecundity is poor here. It is unlikely that this action is going to lead to further good, because there would be such societal discontent at the idea of getting abducted for your organs, right? So you see how you could develop an argument along those lines. Let's consider the purity, right? The purity of the pleasure being gained by additional life years is probably also pretty low, right? Would you want to continue to live if you knew that your organ came from an unwilling, perfectly healthy, and innocent person? Right? That's a much more difficult kind of answer, or pleasure, than if you got the organ from someone who was already dead, or who willingly donated that organ, right? Okay. Finally, let's talk about the extent, right? This one's a little bit more complex than the original example. The extent, right? We'd still have this person's family and society at large would be very scared if again people are abducted for their organs, right? So the extent of this action, right? That's like imagine the chaos and turmoil about that crime has on society, particularly violent crime, right? When violent crime happens, though it's certainly awful for the person who experienced violent crime, it has wide-reaching effects on society. So the effect of that action is not contained just to the person, but it extends far out into the community. Whereas the extent of someone receiving an organ transplant is maybe not as right. We already discussed how the fecundity of this is not super great, so the extent of this is also probably not particularly large. I mean, any one of these people could go on to continue to have a good impact in their lives and in their communities, but maybe the extent of that pleasure is not going to be as much as the extent of the pain and suffering caused by harvesting this organ. Okay, so hopefully that starts to demonstrate how to apply the hedonistic calculus here. A full and proper application of the hedonistic calculus is a lengthy process, right? This takes serious time because you can quite finely articulate the pains and pleasure involved. And utilitarianism is a fundamentally comparative theory, right? When I'm comparing what to do here, I'm comparing not flipping the switch to flipping the switch. There's nothing that tells me what to do in absence of my action here. If I can't act, then there's nothing in question right here. If there are if there's not at least two consequences that I can compare here, then I can't really apply utilitarianism. So it's not enough to just talk about the hedonistic calculus for one scenario, but you have to apply it to at least two. So you can see how this quite quickly can become a lengthy endeavor. But hopefully you also realize that there are some serious resources here, right? You can, again, in quite fine detail, articulate what's going on and why you would prefer one conclusion over the other. Okay, so utilitarianism is a useful theory for a number of reasons. The first thing that makes it a strong moral theory is that it's impartial. We can apply this moral theory without knowing anything about the people involved, and again, it helps to accommodate that moral intuition that one life is as valuable as another, right? Perhaps that is a fundamental belief of ours, that there's no life that is more inherently more valuable than others. Utilitarianism can accommodate that intuition. Utilitarianism also has a strong basis in welfare, right? At some level, we can all agree, why do we do what we do? Because we want to be happy, right? And because that intuition is so core to our understanding of the world, and because we can see that in utilitarianism, that provides it with a strong basis. Utilitarianism is excellent for making decisions that affect lots of people, right? Because it is somewhat mathematical in nature. We can kind of sum up the pains and pleasures involved for various outcomes, and we can execute that plan of action without having to talk about some more complex considerations that are present in other moral theories. The application is not simple or easy, but it is straightforward, I think, right? Add up the pains and pleasures involved, do the one that creates the best outcome. It's once you know the proper formulation of the theory and how to apply it, you kind of know how to apply it. There are some moral theories that even for people who understand them well, it's difficult to apply. It requires a lot more investigation or articulation of why we would do what we do. And finally, utilitarianism can accommodate many ethical intuitions. Its outputs, right, what it suggests you should do in a scenario is often kind of what our ethical intuition was in the first place, right? And this is important because, again, the output of a theory is not necessarily the right thing to do right off the bat. What if it conflicts with our intuition? What do we do then? This can be a problem for some theories, and with utilitarianism, it is also a problem. But for a large amount of cases, what utilitarianism suggests and what we think the right thing to do is say the same thing, right? So this is speaks to a methodology in philosophy called reflective equilibrium. Both our intuition about what we think is right and our theory, which articulates what is right, agree. And these two things should reach an equilibrium. It would be a problem if what our theory suggests is very, very different than what our intuition suggests, because that would suggest that, either our theory is very, very wrong or we are. And we don't like either of those possibilities, right? Okay, so these are the strengths of utilitarianism. What are its weaknesses? Well, it has quite a few. The first one is there is a tyranny of the majority here, right? The minority, in whatever kind of situation that we're talking about here, will always be sacrificed for a greater good, right? Some people object to the idea that the moral problems of a minority are always relegated to the concerns of a larger majority, right? Certainly, if we have different kinds of problems, this arises as an issue in a couple different ethics cases, and this should become a little bit clearer as we look at some additional moral theories. Okay, there's epistemological problems with consequentialist theories in general, mainly because it's hard to know what the effect of our actions are going to be, right? What's the actual effect of them? So I have here history's favorite, and this is a deserved favorite, a whipping boy for the purposes of this example, right? Here's another thought experiment for you. So you're walking along a river and you see someone drowning in the river. Should you jump in and save them? Well, it seems like, if you're a good swimmer, you can jump in and save them. That is the thing that utilitarianism would suggest. You have, of the two options of not jumping in versus jumping in, you've selected the one that will produce the greater amount of utility, all right? But say, instead of, some stranger, it's history's favorite whipping boy, Hitler, right? You jump into the river and you save Hitler, and now the extent of the pain caused by that action is far greater, right? Utilitarianism has then just suggested that what we should do doesn't actually create the best consequences. Okay, so is that a problem? It can be, and there are some ways around this. For instance, you can have expected value consequentialism, which is what is expected to produce the best outcomes rather than what outcomes actually happen, because we are all limited epistemological beings, and we don't always know what the consequences are going to be. I hope that makes sense. Please do ask me questions if that doesn't. Okay. Furthermore, utilitarianism does not accommodate all of our intuitions. Right. It doesn't accommodate the intuition that intentions matter. Right. Say I am trying to help someone and I end up harming them instead. Right. I try to help someone up, they fall and I try to help someone up and I yank too hard and, it pops their arm out of socket, right? Utilitarianism would suggest you did the wrong thing there because the consequences of that action did not produce the highest utility, right? If you had just left them on the ground, they got up by themselves, that would be the better outcome. But you tried to do the right thing. Does not matter on utilitarianism, and generally, certainly my intuitions conflict with that a little bit. Another example of when utilitarianism does not conform to our ethical intuitions, the philosopher Derek Parfit came up with a very famous thought experiment to demonstrate this. He called this the repugnant conclusion. He disliked it so much. So here's the thought experiment, okay? Say you have two societies. You have one society of 10 billion people, and they are all living at lives barely worth living. They're living terrible, terrible lives, but there are tons of people, right? Now, say you have a society of 1,000 people, and they're living the best possible human lives, right? They have all this happiness. Utilitarianism seems to suggest that the world in which you have 10 billion people who are living lives barely worth living is the better outcome than the society in which there are fewer people living much higher quality lives. Why is this? Because the total units of happiness in a world with far more people in it is greater than the world in which you have a fewer amount of people, even if each one of them is experiencing a far more intense and robust kind of life. This seems like an awful conclusion, because I don't think, certainly my intuitions really conflict with the idea that the better of those two options is the one in which people are living lives barely worth living, and there's lots of them, right? This sounds like the start to every, awful sci-fi dystopia ever, right? You have a whole bunch of people like that, and that's supposed to be the future that we should prefer on utilitarianism. Okay, so again, these are serious problems. There are ways in which applying utilitarianism can lead to outcomes that we think are just terrible. So why do I even bother, trying to teach utilitarianism? Why does anyone deploy this theory at all? Well, I think that is a good question. There are a couple analogies to this point. The first thing is that, a moral theory, I don't think the most helpful way to think about it is a way to get some objective standard of what you should be doing, right? It is not supposed to provide moral truth perfectly every single time. It's a tool that you can use to help assess a moral situation. And not all tools are good for every situation, right? If you critiqued a microscope for how well it could look at the moon, it'd be an awful microscope, right? Or like we'd say this tool sucks. But that's not what it's supposed to be used for. And vice versa applies. So I think these various moral theories as different tools that apply and provide ethical insight in various different situations, right? When we talked about these strengths, right, when it comes to decisions that affect lots of people, maybe this is the kind of scenario where utilitarianism is particularly applicable, right? This is the kind of context where you would apply this theory and it provides reliable, accurate results. But if you tried to apply it to, say, for instance, long-term population ethics, like in the repugnant conclusion, that's the improper use of the theory, right? And so it fails to deliver us the kinds of results that we're looking for. Furthermore, I wanted to share this example, right? So take Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian physics we know is wrong, right? It is not in fact how the way that the world works. We can observe this on the quantum scale. I've got the atom to represent that, okay? We know that the world does not operate according to Newtonian physics, and yet, as a professor of mine like to say, Newtonian physics is great if you're trying to drop large, heavy objects on the heads of your enemies far, far away, right? You could design catapults. You can design entire spacecraft according to Newtonian physics, even though it's wrong, okay? So it's not always important to have the perfect moral theory. It's important to know when and how to deploy it, okay? And that's what I suggest utilitarianism and some of the other moral theories that we'll take a look at in this course are like. They are tools that we know are imperfect. We know they are not good in every situation, but they can provide us some valuable moral insight, and they can get us to where we need to be for moral and ethical discourse, even without being the perfect theory. Okay, so hopefully that shows you a little bit of insight in how we are applying these theories. I'm now asking you to do something quite difficult, which is to start to apply the hedonistic calculus to the case that we looked at in the first lesson this week, to life in the parking lot, right? It is okay if this is not the perfect utilitarian analysis. Like I already said, utilitarian analyses take a long time to do properly. They have to involve the entire hedonistic calculus for both options, in all of their messy details. So what I would like you to do instead is to apply 3 of those criteria, right? Talk about why the conclusion that you want to defend is the better of the 2 when using the hedonistic calculus and applying the principle of utility. I hope that makes sense. Please do let me know if you have questions about this moral theory. This isn't the way I typically teach it, but I've tried to be as clear as I can on articulating what the moral theory is, while not dumbing it down too much, right? So that's sometimes a fine balance in teaching. But do let me know if you have questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.